Let's begin by pulling back the curtain on what we really mean when we talk about an avoidant personality. Because here's the truth. Most people who get caught in these relationships think the avoidance behavior is about them. That somehow they weren't enough, or they loved too much, or they made the mistake that pushed the other person away. But that's not the truth. The reality is, avoidant individuals are not running from you. They're running from themselves. They're running from intimacy, from the weight of connection, from the terrifying possibility of being truly seen and accepted for who they are. You see, avoidants are often shaped by early experiences. Maybe it was inconsistent caregiving. Maybe it was rejection. Maybe it was a home where emotions weren't safe to express. Over time, they learned a lesson. Don't get too close. Don't rely on anyone. Don't show too much of yourself because people will leave, or they'll disappoint you, or they'll suffocate you. That lesson doesn't just sit quietly in the background, it becomes the operating system of their entire adult relational life. On the surface, they may look confident, independent, self-reliant, but underneath, there's fear of dependence, fear of engulfment, fear of being vulnerable. And this is where the ego comes in. To protect themselves from those fears, avoidants build up a facade. They create distance, they minimize emotions, they act like they don't need anyone. But make no mistake, this is not strength, it's armor. It's the kind of armor that keeps them safe in the short term, but lonely in the long term. When you're dealing with someone who has avoidant tendencies, what you're really experiencing is that armor. Every unanswered text, every sudden withdrawal, every refusal to commit, it's all part of their defense mechanism. It's not because you aren't worthy of closeness, it's because closeness feels dangerous to them. Now, here's the trap most people fall into. When you're on the receiving end of this behavior, it's incredibly confusing. One moment they're present and affectionate, the next they're distant and cold. That push-pull dynamic keeps you hooked because you're constantly trying to get back to the version of them that showed up when things felt good. And every time you try harder, every time you lean in more, every time you chase their attention, you're reinforcing the very behavior that hurts you. You're feeding their ego. And the avoidance ego thrives on that dance, on being desired, but never truly giving. But before we get to the part about ego destruction and why that matters, you have to understand this foundation. The avoidant personality is not about lack of love, it's about lack of safety. Love for them feels like surrender. It feels like losing control. And so they run. They detach. They push away. It's not about the depth of your worth. It's about the depth of their fear. This understanding is critical because it shifts the way you see the entire dynamic. Instead of internalizing their withdrawal as rejection of you, you can begin to see it as a reflection of them. Instead of saying, "What's wrong with me?" you begin to ask, what is it in them that makes closeness feel unbearable? And that shift is everything. Because once you stop seeing their behavior as an indictment of your value, you stop playing the game on their terms. You stop trying to fix something that was never broken in the first place. You. Let's take this deeper for a moment. Philosophically, the avoidant represents a kind of paradox. They crave love, yet they run from it. They want intimacy, yet they're terrified of it. They are human beings wrestling with one of the oldest human dilemmas, the tension between freedom and connection. On one side, they want the autonomy to protect themselves. On the other, they want the warmth of belonging. But they believe, often unconsciously, that they can't have both. So, they choose distance. And distance becomes their identity. When you're in a relationship with an avoidant, you become a mirror they're constantly trying not to look into. Because your presence, your love, your consistency, it threatens the story they've been telling themselves their whole life. The story that says, I don't need anyone. I'm fine on my own. I'm safer this way. But deep down, they're not fine. No human being thrives in isolation. No human being feels complete while running from connection. That's why, no matter how much they resist, they are still drawn back toward it. And that's why understanding their psychology matters. It equips you to stop making their fear your cage. So here's the takeaway I want you to sit with. Avoidants don't pull away because you're too much. They pull away because closeness demands more of them than they've learned how to give. Their detachment is a shield, not a verdict. And when you understand that, you stop shrinking yourself to fit their limitations. You stop trying to earn what they can't yet offer. You see them clearly, not as the judge of your worth, but as the prisoner of their own fear. And that's the first step to power, knowing the game that's being played. Because when you understand the avoidant, you stop begging for validation and you start reclaiming your own strength. Let's talk about the role of ego in the life of an avoidant, because if you don't understand this piece, you'll stay trapped in the confusion of their hot and cold behavior. Ego, at its core, is a self-protective construct. It's the mask we all wear to move through the world, the identity we build to protect the most vulnerable parts of ourselves. But for the avoidant, ego isn't just a mask they wear occasionally. It becomes their entire armor, the wall that stands between them and true intimacy. Think about it like this. If closeness feels like danger to an avoidant, their ego is the fortress that keeps danger out. And that fortress is built on the illusion of superiority, independence, and control. They convince themselves, and often you, that they don't need anyone. They'll say things like, I'm better off alone, or they'll behave in ways that scream, I don't care. But that's ego talking. That's not their truth. The truth is that they do care, but caring exposes them to rejection, and rejection feels unbearable. So the ego steps in and says, I'll handle this. I'll make sure you never feel small, never feel dependent, never feel at risk of losing yourself in someone else. What's fascinating is how the ego operates in relationships. For an avoidant, ego is both shield and sword. It shields them from their own vulnerability, and it cuts down anyone who threatens to get too close. That's why you'll see avoidants dismissing your feelings, belittling your needs, or downplaying the connection you share. They're not trying to destroy you. They're trying to protect themselves. But in doing so, their ego creates this power imbalance where they feel in control, and you feel like you're constantly fighting for scraps of affection. Now, here's where it gets really tricky. When you respond to that behavior by chasing them, by begging for attention, by over-explaining your worth, you're not breaking through the armor. You're feeding it. Every time you lean in harder, their ego says, see, I'm the one in control here. I call the shots. I get to decide how much love, how much closeness, how much attention comes into this relationship. And the more you feed that ego, the more inflated it becomes. What started as a defense mechanism turns into a full-blown identity. But let's step back and look at the deeper psychology. Ego, at its essence, is fragile. It looks powerful, but it's built on fear. And that's why the avoidant clings to it so tightly. They mistake ego for strength, when in reality it's weakness in disguise. Because true strength isn't pretending you don't need anyone. True strength is being able to need someone and still feel safe. True strength is vulnerability, not avoidance. Yet the avoidant hasn't learned that lesson, so they lean harder into their ego, believing it makes them untouchable. Philosophically, you could say the avoidant is trapped in a false self. They're living in the identity their ego crafted, not the reality of who they are. And this false self comes at a cost. It keeps them distant from others, yes, but it also keeps them distant from themselves. They never fully touch the depth of love they crave because their ego insists love is a threat, not a gift. So, why does this matter for you? The one caught in the orbit of an avoidant. Because once you understand the ego's role, you stop taking their behavior personally. Their detachment, their arrogance, their coldness. It's not about your lack of value. It's about their need to protect the fragile self that lies beneath the armor. And once you see that, you can shift your strategy. Instead of feeding their ego by playing the game of pursuit, you starve it. You stop validating the mask and start reclaiming your own power. And here's the irony. When the ego is no longer being fed, that's when cracks begin to show. The avoidant starts to feel the emptiness their defenses created. They realize that without your constant energy fueling their illusion of control, they're left with themselves. And for someone who's been hiding behind ego their entire life, that's terrifying. It's also the very moment that opens the door for change. I want you to sit with this thought. The avoidance ego is not strength. It's fear wearing a crown. And the moment you stop bowing to that crown, the moment you stop giving it power, is the moment you begin to break the cycle. Here's the hard truth that most people don't want to hear. When you chase someone who's avoidant, you are not breaking down their walls. You are reinforcing them. You're not proving your love or demonstrating your loyalty. You're handing their ego exactly what it wants. And this is the part that stings. The more you try to convince an avoidant of your worth, the less they value you. Let's unpack why. At the core of every avoidant dynamic is control. Remember, for them, closeness feels like danger. It feels like losing themselves. So they create distance, and in that distance, they maintain the illusion of control. Now, when you run after them, when you fill the silence with texts, when you try to fix every cold withdrawal with more love and attention, you're not soothing them. You're confirming their story. Their ego gets fed because your actions say, you get to decide how this relationship works. You set the terms. You're the one with the power. And ego thrives on power. It feeds on that asymmetry where one person does all the giving and the other does all the withholding. This is why chasing never works. You can't outlove someone's fear. You can't pour so much affection into them that it overrides the wiring that says, don't get too close. If anything, the more you pour, the more they retreat, because the act of chasing magnifies their fear. It tells them closeness really is suffocating. It confirms their worst suspicion, that intimacy means losing space, losing freedom, losing self. Here's the psychological catch. Your brain gets tricked by this push-pull dynamic. When the avoidant pulls away, your nervous system panics. You feel the loss of connection, and your body interprets it as danger. So you chase in order to restore safety. And the moment they give you even a breadcrumb of affection, your brain lights up with relief. That hit of dopamine conditions you to chase again. It becomes a cycle. And the cycle doesn't just hurt you. It builds the avoidance ego even higher, because now they know on some level that no matter how far they pull back, you'll always run after them. It's like trying to win the approval of someone who holds the rule book and keeps changing the rules. You're never going to win, but you keep playing because the few moments of closeness feel intoxicating. And yet, every round of chasing costs you something: your dignity, your self-respect, your peace of mind. You start bending, shrinking, and twisting yourself just to get back into their orbit. And while you do that, they sit in the comfort of knowing they don't have to move. You'll come to them. You'll bridge the gap. You'll fill the silence. Their ego swells while your sense of self shrinks. Let's take a step back and really think about the philosophy of this dynamic. What is love if it becomes a chase? What is connection if it's sustained only by one person's pursuit? That isn't love. That's ego and fear playing a game of cat and mouse. And you, by chasing, are not honoring love. You're participating in the game. And here's the paradox. The avoidant may seem like they're rejecting you when they withdraw, but the moment you stop chasing, something changes. They start to feel the absence of your attention. The ego that was once inflated by your pursuit begins to deflate. And this is often the very moment they circle back, confused by the silence they're no longer in control of. But that only happens when you stop feeding the ego with your constant running. So why is this so important to understand? Because once you see the trap, you can stop falling into it. You can stop mistaking chasing for love. You can stop thinking that proving yourself harder will finally win them over. You can break the cycle. And breaking the cycle doesn't just change the relationship dynamic. It changes you. It restores your sense of agency. It reminds you that you are not at the mercy of someone else's avoidance. You get to decide whether you'll keep handing over your power or whether you'll reclaim it. I want you to sit with this. Every time you chase an avoidant, you're really chasing their ego. You're feeding the very thing that keeps them from meeting you where you are. But the moment you stop, the moment you hold your ground, you're no longer participating in their fear-based game. You're standing in your truth. Chasing keeps you small. Letting go makes you powerful. And power, not pursuit, is what shifts the dynamic. Here's the turning point. The moment everything shifts. Not when you convince the avoidant to change, not when you finally get them to stay, but when you take your focus off of them completely and turn it back on yourself. That's the move they don't expect. That's the move that dismantles their ego. Because here's the truth, an avoidance ego thrives on being the center of your emotional universe. As long as your energy is orbiting around their moods, their silences, their disappearances, they remain in control. But the moment you redirect that energy toward your own growth, their entire sense of power begins to collapse. Let's make this simple. You can't change someone who isn't ready to face themselves. You can't heal an avoidant by loving them harder. What you can do is take all that energy you've been giving away and reinvest it in yourself. That's where the real transformation happens. Not because you're playing a game or trying to manipulate them into coming back, but because the moment you stop feeding their ego and start feeding your own life, the dynamic shifts. You no longer operate from scarcity, you operate from strength. Think about how much mental real estate an avoidant can occupy when you're in that cycle. Every day becomes about them. You replay their words. You analyze their silences. You obsess over their mixed signals. That energy drains you, and it traps you in a loop where your identity is defined by how they treat you. But when you step out of that loop, when you make a conscious decision to stop giving them your power, you suddenly free up an enormous amount of space. And that space can be filled with something far more valuable: your own growth, your own healing, your own fulfillment. Here's what happens psychologically. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop clinging. It means you stop negotiating your self-worth with someone else's inconsistency. And the moment you do that, something shifts inside you. You begin to rebuild self-respect. You begin to remember that you are a whole person, not someone waiting to be completed by another. You start to reconnect with your own passions, your own ambitions, your own voice. And that inner shift is what destroys the avoidance ego, because their power depends on your dependence. When you're no longer dependent, they no longer hold power. It's also important to see this from a philosophical perspective. When you attach your value to another person's validation, you place yourself in a prison of conditions. Your worth is conditional on their approval. Your peace is conditional on their affection. Your sense of self is conditional on whether or not they show up. That's not freedom. That's captivity. And the antidote is self-focus. When you shift your energy back onto yourself, you're no longer living reactively, waiting for them to decide how your day feels. You're living proactively, but building a life that's grounded in your own values, your own meaning, your own choices. And here's the paradox. The more you detach and grow, the more the avoidant feels the absence. They're used to your energy feeding their ego. They're used to your chase confirming their power. When that disappears, they're confronted with the silence of their own defenses. For the first time, they feel what it's like not to be pursued. And while they may not admit it, that silence unsettles them. It forces them to confront the reality that the control they thought they had is slipping away. But here's the part I want you to hear clearly. The goal isn't to detach so they come back. The goal is to detach so you come back to yourself. Because once you've reclaimed your energy, once you've remembered who you are outside of the chase, their return doesn't hold the same weight. You're not waiting by the door. You're not bending your life around their avoidance. You're living from a place of strength. And from that place, you get to decide what role, if any, they'll play in your life moving forward. So let's put this into something practical. Every time you catch yourself obsessing over what they're doing, shift that energy. Instead of texting them, journal your feelings. Instead of replaying the silence, go move your body, go build something, go pour into yourself. Every ounce of energy you give away is energy you could be using to build a life that excites you, fulfills you, and empowers you. That's how you destroy ego. Not by fighting it head on, but by refusing to feed it. And I want you to notice something. The more you do this, the less desperate you feel. The less reactive you become. You stop asking, why don't they want me? And you start asking, why do I keep giving my power away? That question is the key that unlocks everything. Because once you start answering it honestly, you'll realize that the only person who can restore your peace is you. When you detach, you don't just take your power back, you remind yourself that love is a choice, not a chase. And the moment you start choosing yourself, everything else begins to change. Here's where things get really interesting. Once you stop feeding their ego, once you redirect that energy back to yourself, something happens in the avoidance mind that they never anticipated. Their defenses begin to crack. Their sense of control starts to slip. And the very detachment they relied on to keep you at arm's length becomes the thing that draws them back in. This is the paradox at the heart of avoidant psychology. When you stop chasing them, that's when they start chasing you. Why does this happen? Let's break it down. For an avoidant, ego is everything. It's their armor, their power, their identity, and your attention, your pursuit, has been the fuel keeping that ego alive. But the moment you pull away, the supply runs dry. Suddenly, they're not being reassured of their superiority. Suddenly, they're not the one setting all the terms. And what was once comfort now feels like a loss. They begin to wonder, Why isn't this person running after me anymore? Why doesn't their world orbit around me like it used to? That discomfort is often the first domino that topples their carefully constructed defenses. There's also something deeply human happening here. No matter how much someone leans into avoidance, the truth is they still crave connection. They still long to be loved, to be chosen, to be seen. The difference is that they've spent their life trying to control the terms of how much of that love they'll accept. When you detach and stop chasing, you take away their illusion of control. And in that silence, in that space where their ego is no longer being fed, those deeper longings start to surface. They feel the pull of the very intimacy they've been resisting. It's almost like turning off the background noise. As long as you're chasing, their ego is loud and dominant. But when you go quiet, they're forced to hear the stillness beneath it. And in that stillness lies their fear of abandonment, their fear of loss, and yes, their buried desire for closeness. They may not admit it, they may not even fully understand it, but the absence of your pursuit unsettles them. It leaves a gap, and human beings will almost always try to fill a gap, even the ones they swore they didn't need. Now, let me be clear, this isn't about playing games. This isn't about using silence as a strategy just to lure them back. If that's your motive, then you're still operating from their ego's frame, and you'll end up right back where you started. What I'm talking about here is authentic detachment, reclaiming your life for yourself. And the byproduct of that authenticity is that it destabilizes the avoidance ego. It forces them to feel the void they've created, and often it triggers their return. But here's the catch. When they come back, it's not always because they've suddenly transformed. It's usually because they're drawn back to the space where their ego once thrived. They feel the loss of power, and they want it back. That's why your role in this moment is so important. If you've been doing the work of detaching, of building yourself up, of focusing on your own growth, then when they return, you're not standing there empty-handed, desperate to receive them. You're standing in your power, grounded, whole, and capable of seeing their return for what it really is, a test of whether you'll hand your power back over or keep it for yourself. Philosophically, this moment is profound. It's a reflection of one of life's deepest truths. What we chase runs away, but what we embody attracts. When you embody strength, when you embody self-worth, when you embody wholeness, people feel it. Even avoidants feel it. And that energy has a gravitational pull. They sense it, and they are drawn back, not because you manipulated them, but because you stepped into alignment with yourself. This is why it's so important to keep your perspective. Yes, the avoidant may return once their ego is destabilized. But the real question is not whether they come back. It's whether you'll let them re-enter your life on the same terms. Because if you let them walk back into the same dynamic, nothing changes. But if you've done the work, if you've grown strong in your detachment, then you'll see their return not as a gift, but as an opportunity to choose differently. And that's the part I want you to carry with you. Their return isn't the victory. Your transformation is. The real power lies in the fact that you no longer need them to validate your worth. If they come back, fine. If they don't, fine. Because either way, you've broken the cycle. You've reclaimed your strength, and you've proven to yourself that you are not defined by anyone else's ego. The avoidant often comes back when the chase ends, but the real triumph isn't their return. It's that you no longer need it. Here's the part that almost no one talks about. When the avoidant circles back, because many of them do, you're faced with a decision. And that decision has nothing to do with them and everything to do with you. The truth is, their return is not the finish line, it's a crossroads. And the choice you make at that crossroads determines whether you step into real power or whether you fall right back into the same cycle that broke you in the first place. When the avoidant comes back, they often come back with just enough vulnerability to make you believe things will be different. They might say the right things. They might act warmer than they ever did before. They might even admit to missing you. But you have to understand this. Their return doesn't automatically mean transformation. It doesn't erase their avoidance. It doesn't dissolve their fear. And it doesn't guarantee they're ready for the depth of love you're capable of giving. Many times, their return is simply the ego reaching out for what it lost. And if you confuse their longing for love with genuine change, you risk being pulled right back into the very pattern you worked so hard to break. So this is where choice comes in. You can't control whether they grow. You can't control whether they face their fear of intimacy. But you can control whether you repeat the cycle. And that's what true power looks like. It's not in getting them back. It's in knowing that you don't need them back. It's standing in a place where you can see their return clearly, without letting it blind you, without letting it drag you back into old habits. Think of it like this. The first time you fell into the avoidant trap, it was unconscious. You didn't know the patterns. You didn't understand the psychology. You thought their withdrawal meant you weren't enough. But now, you do know. Now you see the cycle for what it is. That awareness changes everything. Because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. And once you know the pattern, you have a responsibility to yourself to not step back into it. Philosophically, this is about evolution. Every relationship is a mirror, and the avoidant was your mirror. They reflected your own need for validation, your own tendency to chase, but your own fear of losing someone who could not fully love you. But mirrors are there to teach us. Once you've learned the lesson, you no longer need to keep repeating the same experience. To step back into the old dynamic is to refuse your own growth. To step forward is to honor it. And I know it's not easy, because when they return, the part of you that still craves their validation will flare up. That longing will whisper, maybe this time it will be different. Maybe they've changed. That's the hook of the avoidance cycle. But here's the truth. Real change doesn't happen in silence. It doesn't happen in absence. It doesn't happen overnight. Real change happens when someone consistently chooses to face their fears, to do the work, to show up differently. And unless you see that sustained effort, words and longing are not enough. This is why choosing power over repetition is the most important step of all. Power looks like listening to your intuition, not your fear. Power looks like holding firm to the boundaries you've built. Power looks like recognizing that your worth is not measured by whether they want you back. Power looks like saying, I choose myself first, always. And from that place, whether you take them back or not, you're no longer operating out of desperation. You're operating out of strength. And here's the beauty of that shift. When you stand in your power, you transform the entire story. The avoidant is no longer the center of your universe. You are. Their ego is no longer dictating the dynamic. Your choices are. And that's the real victory. Not that they came back, but that you no longer need them to. So if you find yourself at that crossroads, if the avoidant reappears in your life, I want you to remember this. You're not being tested by them. You're being tested by yourself. Will you step back into the old cycle, or will you choose freedom? Will you hand your power back over, or will you claim it for good? because at the end of the day, real love isn't about who comes back. It's about who you become when they leave. And when you choose growth over repetition, you've already won.